She was the absolute ruler of a rising empire, the queen who united Great Britain and crushed the French Sun King on the battlefield. Yet instead of glory, she died a broken, obese invalid, mocked by history as a dull, fat woman, and betrayed by the only people she ever trusted. Her name was Queen Anne. How could a monarch who reshaped the map of Europe be so utterly destroyed by the secret, poisonous war between the two women who shared her bed? But the seeds of this destruction were sown long before she ever sat on a throne. To see the real Anne, we must strip away the heavy brocade of the official portraits and go back to the beginning, to a childhood defined by a singular, crushing word: neglect. Born in 1665, Anne was a child of the Restoration, a time when England was shaking off the puritanical dust of Oliver Cromwell and diving headfirst into the hedonism of King Charles II. But Anne was not part of the party. She was the second daughter of James, Duke of York, and while the court swirled with spaniels, mistresses, and silk, Anne lived in a shadow. She was a disappointment from her first breath, another girl in a dynasty that was desperate for male heirs to secure the line. Nature seemed to conspire against her from the start. While the court beauties were celebrated for their sparkling eyes, Anne suffered from a relentless, painful condition known then as defluxion. Her eyes constantly watered, ached, and blurred, leaving her in a perpetual state of semi-blindness and physical discomfort. At the tender age of 4, when most children are clinging to their mother's skirts, Anne was packed off to France for medical treatment. Imagine the terror of a partially blind 4-year-old girl, put on a ship crossing the channel to a country where she did not speak the language, separated from her parents, and sent to live with a grandmother she barely knew. That early abandonment planted a seed in Anne's soul that would grow into a twisted, desperate vine, a terrifying fear of solitude, and a clinging, almost suffocating need for affection. She learned early on that love was transient, that parents could send you away, and that the only safety lay in finding one person, just one, who would promise never to leave. In the glittering, dangerous court of France, and later back in the shark tank of English politics, Anne learned to be quiet, to watch, and to hide her heart. When she returned to England, her world fractured further. Her mother died, and her father James did the unthinkable. He converted to Catholicism. In a fiercely Protestant England, this was political suicide. Anne and her sister Mary were ordered by their uncle, King Charles II, to be raised strictly Protestant, creating a bizarre domestic war zone where the children practiced a religion that their father believed would damn them to hell. Anne grew up in a house divided against itself, trained to view her own father's beliefs with suspicion. She was a pawn on a chessboard before she even knew the rules of the game. It was in this atmosphere of insecurity and hidden dangers that she met the force of nature that would define her existence. It was the 1670s, and Anne was a shy, awkward princess. Then she saw Sarah Jennings. Sarah was everything Anne was not. Where Anne was quiet, Sarah was loud. Where Anne was hesitant, Sarah was decisive. Where Anne was plain, Sarah was radiant with a blonde, sharp-eyed beauty that commanded attention. Sarah was a nobody, a minor figure at court, but she walked with the confidence of a queen. For Anne, it was not just a friendship, it was an awakening. She didn't just like Sarah, she worshipped her. In the rigid hierarchy of the court, where everyone had to bow and scrape and use formal titles, Anne proposed a radical secret rebellion. She wanted a sanctuary where they could be equals. She proposed that in their private letters they would strip away their titles. The Princess of Denmark became simply Mrs. Morley, and the fiery Sarah Jennings became Mrs. Freeman. Mrs. Freeman was a name chosen with care. It represented the candor and frankness that Anne craved. She wanted Sarah to be the one person in the world who would tell her the truth, who would not flatter her. But in opening herself up so completely, in handing over the keys to her psyche, Anne was making a dangerous gamble. She believed they were two halves of the same soul. She wrote, "I had rather live in a cottage with you than reign empress of the world without you." She believed this with every fiber of her being. Sarah, however, bright and ambitious, saw something else. She saw a lonely princess who could be the ladder to unlimited power. The true test of Anne's character and the source of her lifelong guilt came in 1688 during the Glorious Revolution. It is hard for us today to understand the sheer emotional violence of this moment. The king, her father James II, was being overthrown by his own son-in-law William of Orange. The country was on the brink of civil war. Anne was forced to make a choice that no daughter should ever have to make: choose her father or choose her religion and her political survival. Guided by Sarah, who despised James II, Anne chose survival. On a dark, stormy night, the Princess of England slipped down a back staircase at the cockpit in Whitehall, cloak wrapped tight against the rain, and fled London to join the rebels. When James II returned to London and found his daughter gone, he collapsed, crying out, "God help me, for my own children have forsaken me." That cry would echo in Anne's ears for the rest of her life. She had secured her position. She was on the winning side of history, but she had committed a sin against the commandment to honor one's father. When the crown eventually came to her, she would wear it with a heavy heart, forever wondering if the tragedies that befell her womb were God's punishment for that rainy night in 1688. And the tragedies were coming. If history has been cruel to Anne's intellect, it has been heartless regarding her body. We often see the caricatures of the obese, gout-ridden queen and forget the horror she endured to become that way. Anne's life was a relentless biological battlefield. She married Prince George of Denmark, a man often dismissed by historians as dull and fond of the bottle. But George was the one steady male presence in her life, kind, loyal, and as devoted to her as she was to him. Together they desperately tried to secure the succession. Between 1684 and 1700, Anne was pregnant at least 17 times. Pause and let that number sink in. 17 times she felt the quickening of life. 17 times she prepared the nursery, ordered the lace, and allowed herself to hope. And almost every single time it ended in blood and silence. She endured miscarriage after miscarriage, stillbirth after stillbirth. She gave birth to babies who gasped for air for an hour and then died in her arms. She watched small coffins being carried out of her chambers with a frequency that would have broken a lesser woman. Modern medicine looks back at Anne's obstetrical history and points to Hughes syndrome, sticky blood, an autoimmune disorder that causes the body to attack the placenta, leading to miscarriages and strokes. But Anne did not have the comfort of a diagnosis. She only had the crushing weight of divine judgment. She lay in her birthing bed year after year, wondering why God was killing her children. Was it the betrayal of her father? Was it her love for Sarah? Out of this carnage, only one child survived infancy, Prince William, the Duke of Gloucester. He was the hope of England, the fragile thread upon which the entire Protestant succession hung. He was a peculiar child, suffering from hydrocephalus, with a head too large for his body, prone to losing his balance. But he was bright, martial, and spirited. Anne poured every ounce of her frustrated maternal love into this boy. He was her reason to breathe. She watched him like a hawk, terrified of every cough, every fever. In July 1700, the nightmare scenario unfolded. Just days after his 11th birthday, William fell ill. He developed a sore throat and a fever. The doctors bled him, the standard brutal treatment of the time, which only weakened him further. Anne never left his bedside. She held his hand as he thrashed in delirium. When he took his last breath, the silence that descended on the room was not just the death of a child, it was the death of a dynasty. The Stuart line effectively died with that little boy. Anne's reaction was terrifying in its restraint. She did not scream. She did not tear her clothes. She wrote to a friend with a desolate calmness, "I shall never be the same again." And she wasn't. The part of her that was a mother had been cauterized. The void inside her was now so vast, so consuming, that no amount of prayer could fill it. It was a void that could only be filled by the total consuming domination of her emotional life by another person. This is the crucible in which Queen Anne was forged. By the time she ascended the throne in 1702, following the death of William III, she was physically wrecked, emotionally traumatized, and riddled with guilt. But she was also a survivor. She was a woman who had walked through the valley of the shadow of death 17 times and kept walking. When she took the crown, she turned to the one person who had been there through it all, Sarah Churchill. Sarah, who had guided her, bullied her, loved her, and protected her. Now with Anne as queen, Sarah became the second most powerful person in the kingdom. She was given the keys to the privy purse, the robes, the household. But there was a flaw in the foundation of their golden age. Sarah had grown arrogant. She had begun to believe that Anne was weak, a pliable fool who needed to be told what to think. Sarah didn't realize that the woman sitting on the throne was no longer the shy princess of the 1670s. She was a mother who had buried 17 children. She was a survivor. And while Anne desperately needed love, she was beginning to realize that what Sarah offered was looking less like love and more like control. As the bells rang for the coronation, signaling a new age for Britain, the seeds of the greatest personal conflict in royal history were already sown. The stage was set for a psychological thriller played out in the corridors of power, where affection was weaponized and silence would become the most dangerous weapon of all. The tragedy of the empty nursery was over. The tragedy of the broken heart was just beginning. As the iron tongues of London's bells rang out to announce a new age, King William III lay dead, his horse having stumbled on a molehill, throwing the unpopular monarch to his mortal end. Now Anne Stuart ascends the steps of the throne. Because her gout is already so severe that she cannot walk the full length of the Abbey aisle, she is carried in a low, open sedan chair, her heavy robes spilling over the sides like molten gold. To the cheering crowds, she is entirely English, a patriot queen who speaks their language and shares their prejudices. But to those inside the gilded cage of the court, it is immediately apparent that this is not a reign of one woman. It is a reign of two. Standing beside the queen, eclipsing the actual monarch with her vitality and dazzling arrogance, is Sarah Churchill. If Anne is the body of the state, slow, suffering, immovable, Sarah is its restless electric spirit. This period, the early years of the 18th century, would come to be known as the Augustan Age, a time of literary brilliance and military glory. But in the private corridors of St. James's in Kensington, it was the golden age of Mrs. Morley and Mrs. Freeman. Never before in English history had a subject held such absolute dominion over a sovereign. Sarah was not merely a favorite. She was the gatekeeper to the queen's soul. Anne appointed her groom of the stole, mistress of the robes, and keeper of the privy purse. In practical terms, this meant Sarah controlled who saw the queen, what the queen wore, and how the queen spent her vast fortune. The keys to the royal apartments dangled from Sarah's waist, jingling a constant reminder of who truly held the power. For a fleeting, brilliant moment, the arrangement worked with a terrifying efficiency. While Anne provided the legitimacy and the crown, the Churchills provided the muscle and the brain. Sarah's husband, John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough, was sent to the continent to command the Allied armies against the superpower of the day, the France of Louis XIV. It was a war for the very soul of Europe, the War of the Spanish Succession, and it was Anne's private purse that fueled it. While John marched across the Low Countries, maneuvering armies like chess pieces, Sarah fought the war at home. She managed the politics, bullied the ministers, and ensured the money kept flowing to her husband's troops. The letters between the Queen and her favorite during these years are suffocating in their intensity. They are not the correspondence of a queen and a servant. They are the desperate, feverish scrawls of a lover terrified of abandonment. "I am so lonely," Anne would write, from the drafty confines of Windsor, while Sarah was away managing her own estates. "I cannot live without my dear Mrs. Freeman. I kiss the dear hands that wrote this 1,000 times." In 1704, the partnership reached its zenith. Word arrived in London of a massive victory on the banks of the Danube, the Battle of Blenheim. John Churchill had crushed the French army, shattering the myth of French invincibility. The country went wild with jubilation. Anne, swollen with pride and gratitude, bestowed upon the Churchills the royal manor of Woodstock and ordered the construction of a palace that would outshine even the royal residences, Blenheim Palace. It was a monument to the Duke's genius, yes, but even more so, it was a monument to the Queen's obsessive love for his wife. But there is a law of nature that applies to politics as well as physics. What rises must fall. And the higher the pedestal Anne built for Sarah, the more dizzying the eventual drop would be. The poison that would kill their love was inevitably politics. The tragedy of their relationship was that while their hearts may have been intertwined, their minds were diametrically opposed. Sarah was a strident Whig. She believed in the power of Parliament, in limiting the monarchy, in the war, and in low church Protestantism. She was a modernist, aggressive and secular in her thinking. Anne, however, was a Tory in her marrow. She believed in the divine right of kings, she cherished the high church, and she instinctively distrusted the warmongering Whigs who she felt wanted to turn the monarch into a mere figurehead. In the beginning, love bridged this ideological chasm. But as the war dragged on and the political stakes grew higher, Sarah stopped persuading and started bullying. She began to view Anne's Tory principles not as a difference of opinion, but as a sign of stupidity. Sarah was a woman of razor-sharp intellect, but she lacked emotional intelligence. She made the fatal mistake of confusing Anne's slow, deliberate nature with lack of wit. She thought she could browbeat the Queen into submission. The golden age began to tarnish. Sarah grew bored with the repetitive, claustrophobic duties of the bedchamber. She was now a duchess, a princess of the Holy Roman Empire, the richest woman in England. Why should she spend hours handing the Queen her gloves or listening to Anne complain about her aching joints? Sarah began to spend more and more time away from court, building her grand palace, managing her family, leaving the Queen alone in the silence of Kensington. But a queen is never truly alone. The court is a vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. Into this widening silence stepped a woman so quiet, so unassuming, that for a long time no one even noticed she was there. Her name was Abigail Hill. The irony of Abigail's rise is that she was Sarah's own creation. She was Sarah's cousin, a poor relation from a branch of the family that had fallen into destitution. Her father had been a merchant who went bust. Abigail had been reduced to working as a servant in other households. Sarah, in a moment of performative charity, had rescued Abigail and placed her in the queen's household as a bedchamber woman. Note the distinction. Sarah was the mistress of the robes, a high aristocratic office. Abigail was a bedchamber woman, a lowly role that involved the dirty, intimate work of caring for the queen's body. It involved emptying chamber pots, washing linen, and, crucially, massaging the queen's legs. Sarah looked at Abigail and saw a non-entity. Abigail was plain-faced with a long nose and none of Sarah's blonde radiance. She was red-haired, quiet, and seemingly submissive. Sarah called her the creeper. She assumed Abigail was too low-born, too ugly, and too stupid to ever be a threat. Sarah Churchill, who prided herself on knowing everything, knew nothing of the human heart. What Sarah failed to understand was that Anne was not looking for a political debater. She was not looking for a brilliant sparring partner. She was a middle-aged woman in constant grinding pain. She was lonely. She was tired of being yelled at, and she was tired of being told she was wrong. Abigail Hill offered the one thing Sarah Churchill was incapable of giving: peace. While Sarah was away at St. Albans or Windsor, holding court and complaining about the Queen's stubbornness, Abigail was on her knees in the royal bedroom. Anne suffered from terrible gout and arthritis. Her legs were often swollen to the size of tree trunks, the skin angry and red. Abigail had a gift for nursing. She would spend hours softly massaging the Queen's feet, applying poultices, never complaining, never lecturing. In the stillness of those late-night sessions, a new intimacy was born. It wasn't the fiery, obsessive passion of Mrs. Freeman. It was a domestic, cozy, safe intimacy. Abigail played the harpsichord beautifully, and Anne, who loved music, would listen for hours, lulled by the notes and the deferential presence of this new companion. Abigail was also a Tory. She shared the Queen's religious views and her political instincts. Slowly, tentatively, Anne began to whisper her frustrations to the woman rubbing her feet. She complained about the Whig ministers who were forcing themselves into her cabinet. She complained about the war that seemed to have no end. And instead of arguing, Abigail would nod and whisper back, "You are the Queen, Majesty. You know best." It was a narcotic. After decades of Sarah's aggressive guidance, Abigail's validation was intoxicating. The shift was subtle at first, invisible to the naked eye. The golden age of Mrs. Freeman was rotting from the inside out, but the facade remained. The turning point, the moment the rot broke through the surface, came in dramatic fashion in 1706 and 1707. Sarah, sensing a coolness in the Queen, did not react with tenderness. She reacted with rage. She ramped up her attacks. She began to berate Anne in front of the servants. There is a harrowing account of an incident involving the Queen's gloves. Sarah, handing the Queen her gloves in a fit of pique, turned her head away with a grimace of disgust, as if the very touch of the Queen was repulsive to her. Anne saw it. The woman who had once written, "I am passionately yours," saw her beloved recoil from her touch. It was a knife in the heart. Then came the Thanksgiving service incident at St. Paul's Cathedral, a moment that historians mark as the beginning of the end. The court was processing to the cathedral to give thanks for another of Marlborough's victories. Sarah, as mistress of the robes, had laid out the Queen's jewelry. Anne, perhaps in a small act of rebellion, wore no jewels. In the royal carriage, packed tight with heavy fabric and tense silence, Sarah noticed the lack of diamonds. She exploded. She berated the Queen all the way to the cathedral steps. As the carriage pulled up and the crowds cheered, Sarah leaned in and hissed a command that would echo through history. "Be quiet. Do not answer me." The Queen of England, the ruler of a rising empire, sat stunned. She descended from the carriage, her face a mask of humiliation. She had been treated like a naughty child in front of her own subjects. Anne returned to the palace in a cold fury. She did not scream back. She did not order Sarah's arrest. That was not her way. Instead, she retreated further into the shadows, into the back rooms, where Abigail Hill was waiting with warm tea and a sympathetic ear. The final betrayal, or the final liberation, depending on whose side you take, happened in the summer of 1707. Abigail Hill, the plain spinster, fell in love. She secretly married Samuel Masham, a groom of the bedchamber. It was a clandestine ceremony, hidden from the prying eyes of the court. But here is the dagger. Queen Anne was there. The queen, who had once shared every thought with Sarah, kept this marriage a total secret from her. She not only attended the wedding, she gave Abigail a dowry of 2,000 pounds from the privy purse, money that Sarah was technically in charge of. It was a breathtaking act of deception. It was Anne declaring silently but unmistakably that she had a private life that Sarah Churchill was no longer part of. For months the secret held. Sarah, busy with her own grandeur, noticed nothing. She didn't notice the hushed conversations when she entered a room. She didn't notice the way the queen's eyes slid away from hers. She didn't notice that the back door to the queen's apartments, once always open to her, was now frequently locked. When the truth finally came out, it would result in an explosion that would shatter the court, destroy the Whig government, and leave a legacy of bitterness that would last for centuries. The discovery of the Masham affair was not just a political crisis. It was a lover's quarrel played out with the fate of nations as the ammunition. The golden age was dead. The age of poison was about to begin. Sarah Churchill, realizing she was being replaced by a chambermaid, would unleash a campaign of blackmail and character assassination so vicious that it would stain Anne's reputation forever. She prepared to strike Anne where she was most vulnerable, her morality and her heart. The weapons were ready, and Sarah was aiming to kill. But as 1707 drew to a close, Anne sat in her chamber, listening to Abigail play the harpsichord, perhaps feeling for the first time in years a strange and terrifying sensation: freedom. She was still a lonely woman, still a grieving mother, but she was done being a puppet. The queen was about to go to war, not against France, but against the woman she had loved more than life itself. The year 1708 broke over the court of Queen Anne not with the promise of a new dawn, but with the gathering fury of a hurricane. The secret was out. The hushed marriage of Abigail Hill to Samuel Masham and the Queen's clandestine presence at the ceremony had finally reached the ears of Sarah Churchill, and the reaction was cataclysmic. For decades, Sarah had believed herself to be the sun around which Anne's world revolved. To discover that a dirty chambermaid, her own impoverished cousin no less, had not only eclipsed her, but had done so while she was looking the other way, was a humiliation Sarah could not process. In her mind, this was not merely a loss of favor, it was a theft. Abigail had stolen the queen's ear, the queen's heart, and, most unforgivably, the queen's political patronage. The war between the two women moved from the shadows of the back stairs into the glare of the public eye. It was a conflict fought with the most vicious weapons available to the 18th century aristocrat: the quill and the whisper. Sarah Churchill, possessing a terrifying intellect and a complete lack of inhibition, decided on a scorched earth policy. If she could not possess the queen, she would destroy her reputation. She began to circulate rumors that were shocking even for the libertine standards of the age. Sarah insinuated that the relationship between Anne and Abigail was not merely one of mistress and servant or even friends, but something unnatural. She wrote letters to the queen that were breathless with rage and innuendo. She accused Anne of having no inclination for any but of one's own sex. Consider the sheer brutality of this tactic. Sarah was effectively threatening to out the Queen of England. She was weaponizing the very intimacy they had once shared. By pointing a finger at Anne's affection for Abigail and calling it criminal, she was implicitly confirming that her own past relationship with Anne had been of the same nature. It was a form of blackmail so reckless it bordered on treason. "Your caresses of that woman," Sarah scrawled in a fury of black ink, "are scarcely decent to be seen by others." Anne received these letters in her private chambers, her hands shaking as she read the venomous words of the woman she had once adored. The Mrs. Freeman, who had sworn eternal devotion, was now threatening to publish their private correspondence, letters written in the heat of youthful passion, to the entire world. Anne was trapped. If she fired Abigail, she admitted guilt and lost her only comfort. If she kept Abigail, she fueled the scandal. With a quiet, stubborn dignity that historians have often overlooked, Anne chose to endure the scandal rather than give up the woman who brought her peace. She burned many of her own letters, but she would not banish Abigail. The tension reached a breaking point in October 1708, with a tragedy that should have united the two women but instead severed the last thread connecting them. Prince George of Denmark, Anne's husband of 25 years, lay dying at Kensington Palace. George had been the anchor of Anne's life. While the world mocked him as dull, to Anne he was the father of her dead children, her constant companion, the only man who had never tried to use her for political gain. As he gasped for air, his lungs failing from severe asthma, Anne sat by his bedside day and night, refusing to leave him. Sarah Churchill arrived at Kensington not to comfort the widow, but to manage the optics. Even as the prince's body was still warm, Sarah began issuing orders. She demanded that the grieving queen leave Kensington immediately for St. James's Palace, arguing that the air at Kensington was unhealthy. Anne, shattered by grief, begged to be left alone with her husband's body for a little while longer. She wanted to mourn. She wanted a moment of silence. Sarah would not have it. She stood over the weeping queen and harangued her. When Anne tried to refuse, Sarah famously snapped, "Madam, you must." She then proceeded to order the servants to prepare the move, ignoring the queen's protests. In that moment, something in Anne died alongside her husband. She looked at Sarah and saw not a friend, but a monster, a woman so consumed by her own need for control that she could not grant a widow an hour of peace. Anne allowed herself to be taken to St. James's, but the damage was irreparable. The Mrs. Morley who had loved Mrs. Freeman was gone. In her place was a queen who had been pushed too far. The years that followed from 1709 to 1710 were a slow, grinding political revolution. The country was weary of the endless war with France. The death toll at the Battle of Malplaquet, a victory that cost 24,000 Allied casualties, shocked the nation. The people were turning against the Whigs and the Duke of Marlborough. They were crying out for peace. Anne, now guided by Abigail and the Tory leader Robert Harley, sensed the shifting tide. She began to dismantle the Churchill power structure, brick by brick. It was a masterclass in slow-motion political execution. First, she dismissed Sarah's son-in-law from his post. Then, she began to ignore Sarah's recommendations for appointments. Sarah, sensing her power slipping away, became increasingly hysterical. She requested audience after audience, which the queen refused. She threatened to print the passionate letters of their youth. She even commissioned a propaganda campaign, spreading pamphlets that depicted Abigail as a witch and a whore, and the queen as her bewitched victim. But the silence from the queen was deafening. Anne had learned the power of the non-answer. The final act of this tragedy took place on April 6th, 1711. It is a scene that deserves to be etched in the memory of history. Sarah Churchill, desperate and furious, used her position as groom of the stole to force her way into the Queen's private dressing room at Kensington Palace. She had been warned not to come, but Sarah Churchill had never listened to a warning in her life. She burst in expecting a fight. She expected screaming, tears, perhaps a reconciliation born of high drama. She was prepared to argue her case, to list her grievances, to bully the Queen back into submission one last time. Instead, she found a wall of ice. Anne stood there, leaning heavily on her cane, her face unreadable. She did not offer a seat. She did not offer a hand. When Sarah began to speak, launching into a tirade of self-justification, claiming she had been misrepresented by lies, Anne simply looked at her and delivered a line of devastating finality. "Whatever you have to say, you may put it in writing." Sarah was stunned. She tried to continue, pleading that she only wanted to clear her name. Anne cut her off, her voice devoid of any emotion. "You said you desired no answer, and I shall give you none." Sarah began to cry. She began to beg. This was the woman who had commanded the Queen to be quiet in public, now reduced to pleading for a single word of kindness. But the time for kindness had passed 10 years ago. Anne repeated the phrase like a mantra, a shield against the emotional manipulation she had suffered for a lifetime. "You said you desired no answer, and I shall give you none." Realizing that the spell was truly broken, that the Mrs. Morley she knew was dead, Sarah Churchill wiped her eyes, turned on her heel, and stormed out of the room. She would never see Queen Anne again. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Sarah was stripped of all her offices. The gold key to the royal apartments was demanded back. When Sarah returned it, she threw it across the room in a final gesture of contempt. The Duke of Marlborough, the greatest general of the age, was dismissed from command shortly after, accused of embezzlement. The most powerful couple in Europe had been brought down not by a foreign army, but by the quiet determination of a sick, lonely woman who just wanted to be treated with respect. With the Churchills gone, the court breathed a collective sigh of relief. The atmosphere changed overnight. The shouting stopped. The aggressive, masculine energy of the Whig War Party was replaced by the quiet, domestic, high Tory atmosphere of Abigail Masham's circle. Abigail was now the undisputed favorite. She was made the keeper of the privy purse. Her husband was raised to the peerage as Baron Masham. But unlike Sarah, Abigail remained in the shadows. She did not try to rule the kingdom. She simply tried to make the Queen comfortable. She managed the Queen's dropsy, mixed her medicines, and shielded her from the endless parade of ministers demanding signatures. But the victory was hollow. Anne was free, but she was dying. The stress of the years of poison, combined with her underlying health issues, had wrecked her constitution. She was morbidly obese, unable to walk, and plagued by gout that had now traveled to her stomach, a condition described as flying gout that caused spasms of agony so intense she would black out. As 1713 turned to 1714, the Queen became a pitiable figure. She was a prisoner of her own failing body. The court, sensing the end was near, turned its eyes away from the dying monarch and towards the future. The succession was in crisis. Anne had no heir. By law, the crown was to pass to the German House of Hanover, to Sophia, and then her son George, distant Protestant cousins whom Anne detested and had refused to allow into England. But there was another option. Over the water in France lived her half-brother James, Francis Edward Stuart, the old pretender. He was the son of the father she had betrayed in 1688. In her guilt-ridden, feverish nights, Anne's thoughts turned often to him. Was it her duty to restore her family line? Was this her chance to atone for the sin of the glorious Revolution? The court swarmed with Jacobite spies. Abigail Masham and the Tory ministers were secretly in contact with the exiled prince, hoping to broker a restoration. They whispered to the dying queen that her brother could save the legacy of the Stuarts. All he had to do was convert to Protestantism. Anne waited. She prayed. She held Abigail's hand and waited for a sign from God or a letter from her brother. But the prince was as stubborn as his father. He refused to abandon his Catholic faith, even for a crown. So Anne was left alone in the crushing dark of 1714. The two great loves of her life, her husband and Sarah, were gone. Her children were dead. Her body was rotting while she was still alive. And outside the palace gates, the vultures were circling, waiting for the last breath of the last Stuart so they could carve up her kingdom. It is here, in these final suffocating months of July 1714, that the tragedy of Queen Anne reaches its crescendo. She had won the war against Sarah Churchill, but she had lost the peace. As a heat wave made the air in Kensington Palace unbreathable, the Queen drifted into a delirium where past and present merged, staring at the door and calling out names no one recognized. But the end had not yet come. Before the silence of death, there was one final chaotic scream of political rage. Instead of granting her the sleep she so desperately craved, her ministers decided to fight a vicious war for supremacy over her deathbed. It was July 27th, 1714. The heat in London was oppressive, a thick, humid blanket that suffocated the city. Inside Kensington Palace, the air was stagnant, heavy with the scent of beeswax candles and the sweat of panicked men. The Queen was dying, and everyone knew it. The two men fighting for the soul of the government were Robert Harley, the Earl of Oxford, and Henry St. John, the Viscount Bolingbroke. They were Tories, erstwhile allies, who had turned into bitter rivals. On this sweltering night, in the presence of the invalid Queen, their feud exploded. They argued until 2 a.m, shouting at each other, accusing one another of corruption and treason, utterly disregarding the exhausted weeping woman sitting in the chair between them. Anne, whose health was already hanging by a thread, was forced to intervene, to dismiss Harley, to try and hold her government together while her body was falling apart. When the meeting finally ended, Anne collapsed. She told her physician, "I shall not survive it." She was right. The stress of that night, the sheer brutality of the male egos clashing around her, triggered the final catastrophe. 2 days later, on July 30th, the Queen suffered a massive stroke. She lost the ability to speak clearly. Her words became slurred, her eyes glazed. The court descended into absolute chaos. Imagine the scene in the Queen's bedchamber. It was a theater of medical horror. The royal physicians, desperate and clueless, unleashed the full arsenal of 18th century medicine on the dying woman. They shaved her head. They applied blistering plasters to her scalp, burning the skin in a futile attempt to draw out the humors. They forced garlic into her mouth. They bled her. Anne, confused and in agony, could only moan. She was being tortured to death in the name of saving her. While the doctors butchered her, the politicians circled like sharks. The succession was still in doubt. Bolingbroke was scheming to bring back the Catholic James Stuart. The Whigs were arming themselves in the streets, preparing to fight for the Hanoverian George. The fate of the kingdom rested on one final decision. Who would hold the white staff of the Lord Treasurer? The holder of the staff would control the government when the Queen died. In a moment of lucid clarity that has become legendary, Anne roused herself from her stupor. On July 30th, she summoned the Duke of Shrewsbury, a moderate man, a man of integrity. With a trembling hand she passed the white staff to him, whispering, "Use it for the good of my people." It was her last political act. By giving power to Shrewsbury, she effectively blocked the Jacobite coup and ensured the Protestant succession. Even on her deathbed, betrayed by her body and her friends, Anne put her country first. She lingered for another day, slipping in and out of consciousness. Witnesses say that in her delirium, her mind wandered back to the traumas of her life. She cried out about her brother, the poor prince. She murmured names. Was she calling for her dead children? Was she calling for Sarah? We will never know. Abigail Masham stood by the bedside weeping, holding the queen's swollen hand, knowing that every shallow breath Anne took brought Abigail closer to her own ruin. At 7:30 in the morning on Sunday, August 1st, 1714, the breathing stopped. Queen Anne was dead. She was 49 years old. The reaction was immediate and unsentimental. There was no great period of mourning. There was only a frantic rush to secure positions in the new regime. The heralds proclaimed George I, the Elector of Hanover, as King of Great Britain. A man who spoke no English, who had never set foot in Britain, and who viewed Anne with contempt, was now the master of the realm. For Abigail Masham, the fall was instantaneous and total. She was not just dismissed, she was erased. The new regime viewed her as a Jacobite sympathizer and a manipulator. She was expelled from her apartments at St. James's and Kensington. She packed her bags, took her harpsichord and her memories, and fled into the countryside. She would live for another 20 years in total obscurity, never speaking publicly of the Queen again, a silent keeper of the secrets of the final years. But if Abigail chose silence, Sarah Churchill chose volume. The moment the Queen was dead, Sarah returned from her self-imposed exile like an avenging angel. She and the Duke of Marlborough rode back into London in a triumphal procession, their carriage cheered by the Whig mobs. They were the victors of history. The woman who had fired them was dead, and the new king, George I, reinstated Marlborough to all his former offices. However, Sarah wanted more than just offices. She wanted vindication. She wanted to win the argument that had ended in that dressing room in 1711. She wanted the last word. Sarah spent the remaining 30 years of her life she lived to the incredible age of 84, obsessively curating the legacy of Queen Anne. She organized her papers. She wrote drafts of her memoirs. She told her side of the story to anyone who would listen, and her side of the story was simple. Anne was a good-hearted but weak, stupid, and gluttonous woman who was easily manipulated. Sarah cast herself as the brilliant, long-suffering servant who had propped up a dull monarch, only to be betrayed by a chambermaid who used witchcraft and cunning to steal the Queen's affection. In 1742, Sarah published her masterpiece of character assassination, an account of the conduct of the Dowager Duchess of Marlborough. It was a bestseller. It was written with dazzling wit and venomous clarity. In it, Sarah laid out the narrative that would dominate history books for centuries. She mocked Anne's intelligence. She mocked her piety. She dismissed their passionate love letters as the silly scribblings of a dependent woman. Because Sarah destroyed so many of Anne's replies and carefully edited her own, she controlled the archive. Historians for the next 200 years relied on Sarah's conduct as the primary source for the reign. They read Sarah's words and nodded. Yes, they wrote, Queen Anne was a dull, fat woman controlled by favorites. They erased the political agency of the Queen. They erased her resilience, and most importantly, they erased the nature of her heart. This was the second tragedy of Queen Anne. First, she lost her children. Then she lost her love. And finally, she lost her story. The Victorians in particular sanitized her life with a ruthless efficiency. 19th century historians like Agnes Strickland and Thomas Macaulay could not cope with the intense, romantic, potentially sexual nature of the correspondence between Anne and Sarah. They viewed it through the lens of their own repressed morality. They categorized the relationship as a romantic friendship, a term invented to strip the passion of its danger. They insisted that women in the past were incapable of sexual or romantic desire for one another. They painted the relationship as a sweet, sexless, sisterly bond that went wrong. The letters that were too explicit were suppressed. The rumors of unnatural vice were dismissed as mere political slander. Anne became Good Queen Anne, a figure on a teacup, a statue in front of St. Paul's, devoid of blood, devoid of lust, devoid of life. But ink is a stubborn thing. Even fire cannot burn everything. In the archives of Blenheim Palace and the British Library, bundles of letters survived. They lay there, gathering dust, waiting for a world that was ready to read them without prejudice. They waited for the 20th century to end, for the sexual revolution, for the rise of queer history. In the 1980s and 1990s, a new generation of historians began to blow the dust off the files. They didn't just read the conduct of Sarah Churchill. They read the raw, unedited scraps of parchment that Anne had written in the dark of night. They read the words of a woman who was not dull but desperate. They read the words of a woman who was not sexless, but burning with a love she could barely contain. The archives opened, and out fell the ghosts. In the late 20th century, historians like Ophelia Field and Anne Somerset began to piece together the fragments that the Victorians had tried so hard to hide. They looked at the letters with fresh eyes, stripping away the layers of prudish censorship. What they found was not a romantic friendship in the Platonic sense, but a relationship defined by a language of eroticism, possessiveness, and absolute surrender. They found letters where Anne wrote to Sarah, "I am your poor, unfortunate, faithful Morley who loves you better than her own life." They found the desperate scrawls where the Queen of England described herself as a slave to her favorite's will. They found the moments where the Queen begged for a touch, a look, a kindness. This was not the correspondence of two sisters. It was the correspondence of a woman who had placed her entire emotional existence in the hands of another woman. The rediscovery of Queen Anne's queer identity, or at least her same-sex romantic orientation, has completely reshaped how we view the Stuart dynasty. We no longer see a fat, dull woman eating herself to death. We see a woman using food to numb the pain of a broken heart. We no longer see a weak puppet. We see a woman paralyzed by the trauma of loving a narcissist. This cultural reclamation reached its peak in 2018 with the release of the film The Favorite. For the first time, the general public saw Queen Anne not as a footnote in a history textbook, but as a tragic, volatile, complex human being. The film shocked audiences with its depiction of the sexual rivalry between Sarah and Abigail. It was grotesque, funny, and heartbreaking. But for those of you watching this who might be wondering where the line between Hollywood fiction and historical fact lies, let us set the record straight. The film got the emotion right, but it took liberties with the details. Queen Anne did not keep 17 rabbits in her room to represent her dead children. Rabbits were considered vermin or food in the 18th century, not pets. Sarah and Abigail did not have a physical brawl in the woods. Their violence was entirely psychological. However, the core truth of the film is undeniable. The letter where Sarah accuses Anne of having no inclination for any but of one's own sex is real. The blackmail was real. The devastating loneliness of the Queen was real. The film succeeded because it finally allowed Anne to be the protagonist of her own tragedy, rather than just a supporting character in the lives of great men. Anne's legacy is often cited as the union of England and Scotland, or the rise of the two-party political system. But perhaps her true legacy is something more human. She is a testament to the enduring, terrifying power of the human heart to seek love in the most inhospitable places. She was a woman who had everything: crowns, armies, palaces, but who died wanting only one thing: to be loved for herself, not for what she could give. Think of her there in the candlelight, the queen of the world, wishing she could simply be a blanket to keep the woman she loved warm. That is the Queen Anne we should remember. Not the caricature, not the statue, but the woman who burned with a fire that no amount of rain in England could ever extinguish.